"Incoming fire, Captain." The urgent shout from Marek Voss pierced the tense air of the bridge, and before Captain Karic Dhalar could respond, the ship jolted violently, throwing everyone off balance. The proximity alarms shrieked, each tone stabbing through the chaos like a needle. "Brace for impact!" Dhalar's voice was commanding, sharp with urgency as his fingers slammed the controls. The lights flickered in protest, casting long erratic shadows across the bridge. The unsparing force of the blast shook the UNS Pioneer again, the hull groaning like it was made of brittle bones. Sparks flew from the nearby console, and Jovan Threx, the chief engineer, cursed under his breath as he scrambled to stabilize the ship's systems. "Shields at 55%, Jovan shouted, his voice rough with panic. "We're not going to survive another hit like that." Dhalar's eyes locked onto the laser plasma displays that painted the outside world in sharp reds and oranges. The enemy fleet, massive and imposing, was coming in fast. Too fast for the Pioneer to outrun. The Elythari fleet had arrived. "All hands, prepare for evasive maneuvers," Dhalar barked, already pivoting toward the helm. The hum of the ship's engines had shifted, now more of a strained growl as the Pioneer pushed itself beyond its limits. The familiar scent of burnt electronics filled the air as the ship responded to the commands. Phelan Cade, the pilot, wasn't fazed. His hands were steady as he wrenched the ship into a sudden, sharp roll, narrowly avoiding a beam of energy that sliced through the space they'd just occupied. "I'm taking us out of their firing range, but they're too close," he yelled over the rising cacophony of alarms. The bridge fell into a grim rhythm. Every move felt like a life-or-death decision. The ship's hull shuddered again as another strike made contact, this time directly on Deck 3. "Hull breach." Sven Olar, the head of security, called out, his voice cutting through the madness. "Emergency containment fields are holding, but not for long." "Get us to Europa," Dhalar ordered, his jaw clenched as he fought to keep his mind focused. Europa, the moon of Jupiter, humanity's last sanctuary. It was their only hope of surviving long enough to regroup. They couldn't let the Elythari destroy them here. A cold sweat trickled down Dhalar's back as he glanced at the display again. The alien fleet was on their tail, no more than a few clicks away. Every move they made felt like a calculated risk. One misstep, and they'd be wiped out. "Captain," Marek called, his voice tight with urgency. "They're already on the comms." The Elythari aren't trying to communicate. They're sending another salvo. "Engage countermeasures," Dhalar snapped, voice still steady. "And don't stop until we're clear." Sven's eyes scanned the readouts with a grim focus. "If we don't outrun them, we'll have to fight them head-on." "We'll fight if we have to, but we're getting out first," Dhalar said, as the ship twisted and shuddered, its engines screaming in protest. Another round of fire sent a shock wave through the Pioneer, rattling loose equipment and knocking out a few minor systems. The smell of burned wires lingered in the cabin, thick and acrid. The Pioneer's thrusters roared as they pushed harder, the ship lurching forward like an animal fleeing from its predator. The icy expanse of space stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving. But they had no choice. They had to outrun this. Suddenly, the ship jolted violently again, this time from a direct hit on their port side. A loud, high-pitched whine filled the bridge, followed by a burst of light that illuminated the ship's interior in flashes of white. Dhalar's vision blurred momentarily, and he braced himself against the console. When the light subsided, he saw the damage. Sparks sputtering from the side panel, the glowing emergency lights flickering as systems struggled to remain functional. "Engine failure imminent, Captain," Jovan shouted, his voice strained. "We can't take another hit like that." "Prepare for jump, now," Dhalar barked. "We're making for Europa, and we're jumping as soon as we can." The jump to Europa was their only shot. Dhalar didn't have to look at the display again to know how close they were to the edge. The ship was in no condition to withstand another assault, and the Elythari would be relentless in their pursuit. He had to act now. "Jump sequence initiated," Phelan called, his fingers flying over the controls, the ship's engines shuddering in protest as they prepared for a leap into the unknown. "All systems at critical. Hold tight." The walls of the bridge groaned as the ship's engines howled louder. Then, with a sickening lurch, the fabric of space twisted around them. The familiar low vibration of the ship disappeared into a strange silence. The stars outside blurred into streaks of light as the ship shot forward, every fiber of the Pioneer pushed to its limits. Dhalar's breath slowed, his muscles tense with the anticipation of what would come next. There was no guarantee they would survive. There never was. When the jump ended, it was like waking from a nightmare. The ship came to a shuddering halt in the quiet orbit of Europa. For a moment, everything was still. No alarms blaring, no explosions, just the eerie hum of emergency lights. "Europa," Marek Voss said, his voice almost a whisper. "We made it, for now." Dhalar stood silently, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His crew, bruised and battered, but alive. But the war was far from over. The Elythari would be coming, and they would not be caught off guard again. "Send a distress signal to Earth," Dhalar ordered, his voice steady, though his eyes were full of unspoken weight. "Tell them we're alive, but we need more time. Time to rebuild." The crew exchanged quiet, uncertain glances. But Dhalar wasn't waiting for their approval. There was no other choice now. Their survival, the survival of humanity, rested on what came next. The future was still unwritten, but one thing was certain. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The quiet of Europa's orbit hung like a heavy blanket over the bridge of the UNS Pioneer. The ship had limped into its temporary safe harbor, battered, bloodied, but alive. Every breath felt like it could be the last for a ship on the brink of collapse. But for now, the Pioneer was still operational. Dhalar stood at the command station, his hands braced on the console, eyes fixed on the laser plasma display. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. Instead, he was lost in thought, his mind racing through the aftermath of the attack. The damage was extensive, and though Europa offered temporary safety, it was the alien fragment they had recovered from the wreckage that now consumed his thoughts. The potential it held could change everything. "Captain," Marek's voice cut through the silence, bringing Dhalar back to the present. "We need to make a decision about this tech. It's dangerous to keep it on the ship without full analysis." Dhalar turned slowly, locking eyes with his tactical officer. The words weren't a surprise. He'd expected the pushback. But this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about evolution. "You're right," Dhalar replied, his voice quiet, measured. "But we can't afford to sit on it. It's not just a weapon, it's a key, a way to get ahead." Marek studied the fragment in the containment field across the room, a twisted piece of alien metal, shimmering faintly with an eerie glow. The air around it seemed to hum with its own strange energy. It wasn't like anything humanity had ever encountered before. "We don't know what it's capable of yet," Marek muttered, his brow furrowed. It could backfire, Captain. It's our only shot, Dhalar answered, firm, unwavering. We can't wait for the Elythari to make the next move. We take this chance now, or we let them crush us. Marek's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. There was no room left for indecision. The threat was real, and the longer they waited, the more likely the Elythari would track them down and finish what they'd started. Jovan Threx, the chief engineer, stepped forward, his face pale from exhaustion. "I've run the initial tests," he said, his voice low and focused. "It's not like anything I've ever seen. The material, it responds to external stimuli. If we can tap into that, we could build ships that repair themselves in real time. It could revolutionize our fleet." Dhalar's eyes sharpened. "How long until we can integrate it into our systems?" Jovan hesitated, wiping a layer of sweat from his forehead. "It's not that simple. The material is unstable. We need a way to stabilize it before it can be used effectively. I'm talking weeks, maybe more, to make it safe enough to experiment with." "Then let's make it happen," Dhalar said. "Get your best people together. We'll start with the small-scale tests and work our way up." As Jovan moved toward the engineering bay, Dhalar's mind raced. The technology had to be their key to survival. With the Elythari closing in, there was no time to waste. He turned to Marek, who was still observing the alien fragment through the containment field. "I want you to get every weapon system we have online," Dhalar said, his tone sharp. "We're going to need more than just defensive tech if we're going to turn this war around." "I'll get to it," Marek replied, his voice steady but tinged with a hard edge. The tension in the room felt suffocating, and yet Dhalar knew it was necessary. Every decision now had to be calculated, precise. He couldn't afford to be wrong. The next few hours were a blur of motion, each member of the crew taking on a vital role. Jovan and his team worked tirelessly, running tests on the alien fragment and attempting to stabilize its energy output. The air in the engineering bay was thick with the sharp scent of burned wires as they pushed their equipment to the limit. Over the next few days, Dhalar watched as the crew made slow but steady progress. The first breakthrough came when the alien material, after being exposed to a high-energy pulse, reformed itself into a smooth surface, its shifting patterns almost hypnotic. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fuel their hope. In the command center, Marek and Dhalar pored over strategy plans, preparing for the inevitable return of the Elythari. Every decision felt like it carried the weight of humanity's future. The Pioneer wasn't just a ship anymore. It was their last stand. They couldn't afford failure. "We've got a chance," Marek said, looking at the strategy map on the plasma display. "If we use the new material on the hulls, we could create a fleet capable of adapting in real time to enemy fire. It would make us almost impossible to predict. But the Elythari will come prepared," Dhalar responded, his voice calm but laden with the pressure of the situation. "We need to outsmart them. We've got to think 2 steps ahead." Marek nodded, understanding the stakes. "We've never fought a battle like this before, but I believe in this crew. They'll pull through." The days wore on, and the material began to take shape. The first test flight of the newly reinforced hull was a revelation. As the ship's exterior absorbed and adapted to the environmental variables around it, the crew witnessed something incredible. The ship was learning, adapting to its surroundings as though it was alive. The AI systems connected to the material began to evolve, analyzing the incoming threats and adjusting defenses accordingly. For the first time since the attack, Dhalar felt a flicker of hope. But there was no time to celebrate. The Elythari wouldn't wait. They would be back. The question was, would they be ready? In the engineering bay, Jovan stood in front of the modified hull, eyes wide in disbelief. I don't believe it," he muttered, running a diagnostic scan over the material. "It's not just adapting, it's evolving, on its own." Dhalar stepped forward, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "That's the key, Jovan. That's how we win this." "We're not just repairing the damage," Jovan said, shaking his head in awe. "We're building something new." Dhalar's eyes locked onto the hull, the reflective surface shimmering with untapped potential. This was it, the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The piece of alien technology that had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle now held the key to humanity's future. "Start building the fleet," Dhalar commanded, his voice low but full of authority. "We don't have much time." As Jovan and his team began their work, Dhalar turned back to the bridge, where Marek was already formulating a battle plan. The pieces were falling into place. The Elythari would be coming, but they were no longer the hunters. The tables were turning. But the real test was still ahead. What would the Elythari do when they discovered that humanity had used their own technology against them? The mystery loomed larger than ever. And for the first time in days, Dhalar couldn't help but feel the thrill of something more than just survival. The sounds of progress filled the air on the Pioneer as the crew scrambled to assemble humanity's last hope. The brief peace of Europa had given them only a slight reprieve, but Dhalar knew it wouldn't last. The Elythari would be back soon, and they had no intention of simply surviving. They were preparing to fight, to strike back with everything they had. The alien material had proven far more promising than they'd hoped, but now came the real test. Could they turn it into something capable of facing down the Elythari? Inside the engineering bay, Jovan Threx worked feverishly, sweat dripping down his forehead as he continued his relentless effort to integrate the adaptive material into the ship's framework. The air was thick with the acrid scent of soldering equipment and burning circuits, a constant reminder of how fragile their situation was. They weren't just building ships, they were creating a whole new form of warfare. Every move was critical. Every failure would be catastrophic. "Jovan," Dhalar called, stepping into the chaos of the bay, his boots echoing softly against the metal floors. "How's the integration coming along?" Jovan barely looked up from his workstation, his focus unwavering as he adjusted the power conduits feeding energy into the new hull plating. "We're making progress, Captain. Slowly. The material's stable for the most part, but it reacts unpredictably when we push it too far. We're running out of time." Dhalar's jaw tightened. Time was something they didn't have. He turned toward the laser plasma display mounted on the wall, where the projections of the ship's schematics blinked with urgency. "We've got enough for one test ship, right?" "Barely," Jovan replied, his voice strained. "But it's a start. If this works, we'll have a prototype. But we can't afford to make any mistakes." Dhalar studied the projections, the feeling of dread settling deeper in his chest. He could almost feel the Elythari fleet closing in, lurking just beyond the edge of their sensors, ready to tear apart everything they had worked for. "Get it done, Jovan. I need that ship operational in 24 hours. Without waiting for a response, Dhalar turned on his heel and left the engineering bay. As he walked through the corridors, the low hum of the ship's remaining systems echoed through the narrow hallways. His thoughts were sharp, his mind running through every possible outcome of this mission. The stakes were no longer just survival. They were fighting for humanity's place in the galaxy. Marek Voss was already at the war room, his eyes glued to the heads-up display as he scrolled through the tactical map of the solar system. "I've got something," Marek said without looking up. His tone was flat, but there was an edge of urgency in it. "I just picked up a faint signal from the Elythari fleet. They're moving. We don't have much time." Dhalar's fists clenched at his sides. "They're coming. I want every ship we have up and running within the next 6 hours. Prepare the fleet." The crew had managed to convert several older ships into makeshift war vessels, reinforced with the newly adapted material. They weren't ready for a full-scale assault, but it was all they had. "I've coordinated with Bran Haldren in logistics. We're moving supplies to the hangars now," Marek added. "It'll be tight, but we can get this done." Dhalar nodded, though his mind kept returning to the unknowns. The unknowns about the material, the unknowns about their enemy, and the unknowns about whether this new fleet could truly stand against the Elythari. Each new step was a gamble. "I want to meet with the rest of the crew," Dhalar said, his voice low, but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "We'll need to adjust our tactics. These ships can't fight like the Pioneer. They have to think for themselves." The war room buzzed with activity as Dhalar addressed the senior officers, the laser plasma displays flickering with the map of the Elythari fleet's movements. The intensity in the room was palpable. Each officer was doing their part, but everyone knew the odds. Even if their new ships could adapt on the fly, they still had to face a vastly superior enemy. "We don't just need firepower," Dhalar said, his gaze steady. "We need strategy. We need to outsmart them." "We've been testing the ships," Marek said, tapping a few buttons on the console to bring up data from the first prototype. "The AI is adapting, learning as it goes." The test ship's hull reconfigured itself after a few simulated strikes, and the defensive systems upgraded instantly. Jovan's voice came through the comm, crackling with static. "We've just finished testing the main reactor. I've optimized the energy flow, but we'll need to make adjustments after the first few battles. It'll be a trial by fire." "Understood," Dhalar replied, nodding sharply. "We'll have to keep up with it." The tension in the room was thick with anticipation. Dhalar knew that the true test would come when the Elythari fleet entered the system. Until then, they were only preparing for the storm. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. Hours passed in a blur of activity. In the hangars, engineers worked alongside pilots to integrate the adaptive technology into the ships. The tension was almost unbearable, the feeling of urgency pressing against their chests. Every moment was a countdown to what they all knew was coming. "Captain, we're ready," Marek's voice crackled through the comm, his tone tinged with both pride and caution. "First ship is operational. The adaptive hull is holding up under pressure, but we need to move fast." Dhalar walked down the narrow corridor toward the hangars, the sounds of the crew's frantic work rising around him. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him, but it was the only way forward. There was no other choice. As he entered the hangar, his eyes immediately locked onto the ship that would lead their charge. The new vessel gleamed in the harsh artificial light, its sleek form twisting and shifting in ways that felt almost unnatural. It was human-made, yet it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The ship was their best chance, but Dhalar's gut tightened as he stared at it. "Ready for combat?" Dhalar asked the pilot, a young man named Phelan Cade, who had shown remarkable skill despite his inexperience with such advanced technology. "Ready, Captain," Phelan replied, his voice firm, though his hands were shaking slightly. It wasn't fear. He was focused, determined, just like the rest of them. The silence between them hung for a moment before Phelan added, "I'll bring it back, sir." Dhalar nodded, his jaw tight. "Don't think about bringing it back. Think about the enemy. That's all that matters now." As Phelan climbed into the cockpit, Dhalar turned and walked back to the bridge, the weight of what lay ahead pressing heavily on his chest. The fleet was nearly ready. The first ship, however imperfect, was ready. It was time to show the Elythari that humanity had something they didn't expect. The Pioneer moved into position. Dhalar stood by the command console, staring out at the stars, knowing that this fight was their chance. The first steps toward victory. They were no longer running. They were going to face their enemy head-on. And, as the crew prepared to deploy their new fleet, a thought stirred in Dhalar's mind. A question that would haunt him in the days to come. What if the Elythari already knew what was coming? The mystery of their next move hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The tension in the bridge was palpable, thick like smoke in a sealed room. Captain Karic Dhalar stood tall, eyes locked onto the laser plasma display, where the outline of the Elythari fleet materialized in eerie red lines. The small fleet of adaptive ships had completed their final adjustments, and the time for waiting had passed. The Elythari were no longer just a distant threat. They were right on the edge of the system, closing in on Earth with a merciless speed that sent a chill through the crew. "Targeting systems are online," Marek Voss said, his fingers moving swiftly over the console as the tactical data appeared on the heads-up display. His voice was calm, but Dhalar could hear the undercurrent of urgency. "We're outnumbered, Captain. The only way we'll make it through this is with a flawless strike." Dhalar's gaze hardened. His fingers drummed against the control panel as he studied the incoming fleet. It was a display of overwhelming firepower, enough to wipe them out in moments. But they weren't just going to roll over. They had something the Elythari hadn't anticipated: adaptability. His fleet was designed to think and learn in real time. The question now was whether that would be enough. "We can't let them dictate the battle," Dhalar said, his voice steady but intense. "We draw them into a trap. Marek, I need you to set up a decoy formation. Make them think we're weaker than we are." Marek glanced at the strategic display, then back at Dhalar. "You're thinking of splitting the fleet, aren't you?" "Yes. They'll want to engage the core of our forces first, but when they do, we'll hit them from the flanks. We use the adaptive ships to stay unpredictable. Every attack, every movement will be a lesson learned in real time." A moment of silence passed, broken only by the beeping of the tactical system as it updated. Marek's hands hovered over the controls. "It's risky, Captain. If we get it wrong, they'll outmaneuver us in a heartbeat." "That's why we can't afford to get it wrong," Dhalar said, his eyes narrowing as he studied the map. "We don't have a second chance." The crew worked quickly, each member in sync as the preparations unfolded. The first phase was critical. If the Elythari took the bait, the rest of the battle would unfold according to plan. Dhalar stood behind the helm, eyes scanning the crew as they worked, every face a mixture of tension and determination. They all knew the stakes, but none of them flinched. This was the moment they had trained for. The decoy formation, a small group of ships disguised as the main fleet, moved into position. They were fragile, built for speed and distraction, not endurance. The true strength of humanity's fleet lay in the newly designed adaptive ships, but they had to wait, hidden in the shadows. It was a gamble, but it was their best shot. "Decoy fleet is ready." Phelan Cade's voice came through the comms. The pilot's hands were steady, his expression determined. "We're in position. Let's see if they bite." On the laser plasma display, the Elythari fleet moved closer, their massive warships cutting through space like predatory beasts. Dhalar could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, but his posture remained unwavering. The countdown in his mind was relentless. Every second, every move, was a piece of a larger puzzle that had to fall into place. The Elythari took the bait. Their ships veered toward the decoy fleet, eager to destroy what they assumed was the weakest point. Dhalar's eyes flicked to the heads-up display. He couldn't let this moment slip away. "Now," he said, his voice crisp with command. "Launch the main fleet. Strike fast, strike hard." The ships erupted from their hiding places, their adaptive hulls shifting and reforming as they surged forward. The first shots fired from the Elythari vessels were aimed at the decoys, but the adaptive ships, capable of learning and reconfiguring under fire, seemed to appear out of nowhere, striking from angles the enemy didn't expect. As the first blasts from the Elythari collided with the decoy ships, the main fleet entered the fray, weapons blazing. The space around them seemed to distort with every shot, as if the very fabric of reality was bending under the strain of the conflict. Dhalar's heart raced, but his mind stayed sharp, analyzing every move, every counterattack. The battle was like a complex chess match, with humanity's ships constantly evolving to meet the changing threat. "Shields holding," Jovan Threx reported from engineering, his voice tight with focus. "But we're pushing them to their limits. The hulls are adapting faster than we anticipated, Captain." "Good," Dhalar muttered under his breath. The adaptive ships were already outperforming his expectations. Each ship's hull seemed to ripple as it absorbed incoming fire, adjusting its form to redistribute energy and strengthen its defenses. What had once been a simple design was now evolving into something formidable. But the battle was far from over. The Elythari were relentless, and they were not going to fall easily. "Captain, we've got an unexpected move," Merrick said, his voice laced with tension. "They're recalibrating their weapons. They've learned faster than we thought. They're countering our adaptive defenses." The realization struck like a cold slap. The Elythari were evolving too, learning from every strike. But Dhalar wasn't about to back down. "We adapt faster," he said, his tone firm as he turned to face the tactical officer. "Merrick, initiate the next phase. Target their weak points. We know they've got vulnerabilities. Now we exploit them." Merrick's fingers flew over the console, rerouting fire towards the Elythari's exposed flanks, hitting the spots where their adaptive tech hadn't yet compensated for human ingenuity. The first of the Elythari ships began to fracture under the concentrated fire, their shields buckling as their hulls began to crack and peel apart. The sight was exhilarating but short-lived. Another blast from an Elythari warship hit one of the adaptive ships, sending a shockwave through the Pioneer. The ship shook violently, the impact reverberating throughout the structure. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the bridge. Dhalar gritted his teeth, fighting the rush of panic that threatened to rise. "Damage report," Dhalar snapped, his voice low and controlled, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "Hull integrity at 70%, Jovan called over the comms. "Engines are stable, but we've lost forward-facing shields. I'm rerouting power." "Keep us in the fight, Jovan," Dhalar ordered, already anticipating the next move. He couldn't afford to give ground. We'll finish this now. The human fleet pushed forward, relentless in their assault. The adaptive ships continued to evolve, adjusting their configurations with lightning speed as they countered every move the Elythari made. Dhalar's mind raced with strategy, analyzing the ebb and flow of the battle. The Elythari were formidable, yes, but they had underestimated humanity's capacity for growth, for evolution. Another shot from the Pioneer's main guns tore through an Elythari cruiser, its shields collapsing in a flash of light. The first victory for humanity in the battle. But it wasn't enough. Dhalar's mind remained focused, eyes never leaving the laser plasma display. They had the advantage now, but it would only last as long as they kept pushing forward. "We've got them on the run," Marek said, his voice barely a whisper of relief. Dhalar's eyes flicked over to him, sharp and calculating. "We haven't won yet. Push the fleet. Now is when they'll start making mistakes." The final phase of the battle had begun, and Dhalar's words rang true. The Elythari, disoriented by the unexpected resilience of their enemies, began to falter, their fleet breaking formation. In that moment of weakness, humanity pressed forward, adapting with every shot fired, every move made. The stars above the battlefield burned brighter as the final shots rang out, and the once mighty Elythari fleet was scattered, crippled, defeated. The sound of distant cheers echoed through the bridge, but Dhalar remained silent, staring at the flickering heads-up display. The aftermath of the battle was a strange silence, a calm before an even greater storm. The last of the Elythari warships flickered and died, their massive forms drifting helplessly in space like broken giants. The air in the bridge of the UNS Pioneer was thick with the remnants of adrenaline, the crew still catching their breath, their movements slow and deliberate. The battle had been fierce, relentless, but it wasn't the end. Dhalar stood before the laser plasma display, his hands braced against the console, watching the remnants of the Elythari fleet scatter. The glow of the tactical map illuminated his face, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight of the decisions still to come. The fight had shifted. The tactics they'd implemented, everything they'd risked, had worked. But the cost was not yet fully realized. "Captain." Marek's voice cracked through the heavy quiet. His tone was flat, but the sharp edge of disbelief still lingered. "We did it. We actually did it." Dhalar didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the stars ahead. "We've won this battle. That's all we've done." "But they're retreating. We've—" Marek started, but Dhalar's gaze cut him off. "The Elythari won't just give up," Dhalar said, his voice low, every word a carefully measured beat. "We've made them bleed, but they'll come back. They always do." Marek stepped closer, his steps almost too careful. "We've done more than that, Karic. You saw them. They're broken. They didn't expect us to hit them this hard." Dhalar's jaw tightened. They didn't expect us to adapt, to learn, to do what they never thought possible. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The question had shifted. The Elythari might retreat now, but they would return, and humanity had to be ready. It wasn't about surviving anymore. They were changing the game, shifting the balance of power in a universe that had long since believed humanity's time had passed. "I'm sending the message to Earth Command," Marek said, his voice quieter now. "They'll need to know what we've done here, what we've achieved." "They'll know soon enough," Dhalar replied, his voice distant, focused. His fingers brushed across the heads-up display, pulling up the next stage of their plan. the words they had to send to Earth, the words that would mark the beginning of a new era. Humanity was no longer the underdog, no longer the species waiting for the next attack, the next threat to destroy them. "We've proven something today," Dhalar continued, his voice steady and unyielding. "We've proven we can outthink them, outlast them, adapt faster than they ever could." A brief silence followed, and in it the weight of his words settled on the crew. They had done it, but the war, humanity's true rise, was just beginning. "We've taken their greatest weapon," Dhalar said finally, turning away from the display and meeting the eyes of his officers. "But it's not just about what we've learned. It's about what we do with it, how we use it, and they won't see it coming." He paused, letting the words land. A ripple of understanding passed through the crew. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about rewriting the rules of the galaxy. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for a future where they would no longer be the prey, where they would shape their own destiny. "Get the fleet into formation," Dhalar ordered, his voice hardening. "We're going to show them what happens when they think they've underestimated us." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. They were on the edge of something bigger than just a battle. This was the dawn of humanity's rise, the turning point in a war that would redefine the course of the galaxy. The ships in the fleet shifted into formation, the adaptive tech still working its magic, reconfiguring their shapes for maximum efficiency. The AI that linked them together hummed with life, a collective intelligence that learned with every passing second. The ships were not just vessels anymore. They were sentient, living things, evolving in real time, each one an extension of humanity's will to survive. Dhalar watched as the tactical display adjusted, the coordinates of the next Elythari fleet movement coming into view. They were regrouping, preparing for a counterstrike. But Dhalar wasn't worried. The rules of engagement had changed. Humanity was no longer scrambling to defend itself. They were setting the terms of the fight now. "We're not just going to hold them off," Dhalar muttered under his breath. "We're going to make them wish they'd never come here." The crew looked to him with a mixture of disbelief and determination. They had seen him lead them through the worst. They had seen him make the impossible possible. And now they were ready to follow him anywhere. The future of humanity was in their hands. The first salvo from the Elythari hit the human fleet, but it was different this time. The adaptive ships absorbed the fire, reconfigured their armor, and returned the shot with devastating accuracy. The Elythari had relied on brute force for so long that they didn't know how to react when the battlefield itself started to fight back. The human ships, once seen as inferior, had become something more, something beyond what the Elythari had prepared for. Dhalar's mind raced with calculations, analyzing every move. The AI was growing smarter, adapting to the evolving tactics of the Elythari. They were no longer fighting a war, they were learning from it. And that was the key. "We're not just copying their technology," Dhalar said, his voice cutting through the chaos of the bridge. "We're improving it. And when they come back, they'll find a different species waiting for them." As the battle raged on, humanity's fleet moved like a single organism, fluid, adaptive, and deadly. The AI shared its strategies, each ship learning from the other, adapting on the fly. The Elythari tried to regroup, but their tactics were no match for the relentless evolution of humanity's fleet. In the distance, the remaining Elythari ships began to retreat, their engines sputtering as they limped away. The human fleet pursued, not to destroy, but to ensure the message was clear. As the last of the Elythari ships disappeared from the tactical display, Dhalar let out a slow breath. They had done it. The impossible had been achieved. Humanity had not only survived, they had taken the technology of their enemies and used it to become something greater. The bridge fell silent for a moment, the crew standing in awe of what they had just accomplished. They had not only fought back, they had reshaped the very nature of warfare. The future had been reclaimed. "We've shown them who we are," Dhalar said, turning to face his crew, his voice a low, steady flame. "We're not the ones who are afraid anymore. We're the ones who will decide the future." The galaxy had underestimated humanity. They thought they could crush them, extinguish them in the vastness of space. But what the Elythari didn't know, what they could never have known, was that humanity would rise. And this was only the beginning. The stars, once distant and cold, were now within their grasp.